everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. Today I want to share with you how I like to make DIY watercolors. This is a little bit of a process, so this is a longer video, but I wanted to be sure that I included all the information here. The first thing I want to start with are your supplies that you are going to need. Now this can vary a little bit, and I'll share some things that you can sub out here and there. But first, the foremost, what you are going to need is going to be a watercolor binder. Now, you have a few options here. You can buy a watercolor binder that is pre-made. It is quite pricey, so I'm also going to share a recipe with you on how to make your own. If you decide to make your own, there are going to be a few more supplies that you're going to need. There are pros and cons both to buying it and to make it yourself. It really just depends on what you're looking for. If you're going to buy it, you are going to pay more for a smaller amount, but it's going to last you longer. It is shelf stable. If you make it, it's going to be a cheaper option. You can make what you need and remake as you need. It is time consuming, but it's a better option if you're looking to save a little bit of money. You will also need some sort of container to keep this if you make your own, but more on that in a moment. Now, something else you are going to need is a glass surface to mull your paint on. I'm using a cutting mat here. You can use a glass plate. You can use some sort of glass mirror or glass window pane, anything glass, smooth surface to put your paint and mix it on. You also need some sort of glass muller. They have paint-specific mullers that you can buy. They are quite pricey. So I actually found this on Amazon. It's for canning, but it's a flat bottom surface with a handle that you can use to mull your paint, and it's glass. That's what you really need. You can use a flat bottomed glass if you have that. There are a number of different things you can use. Just something to mull your paint with. You also need some sort of palette knife or scraper. You can use an old credit card or gift card as well. But palette knives are pretty cheap. You also need something to put your finished watercolor into, whether that be paint pans, a watercolor palette, tube, something along those lines. I'm using these. Everything that I am using, I will link down in the description box below. The majority of it you can find on Amazon. Now, the last thing you need is some sort of pigment. There are different kinds of pigments you can use. I'll be using mica powders today. I will be using shimmer, fluorescent, and chameleon powders. You can use eyeshadows, spices, natural earth pigments. There are a lot of different things you can use. Again, I will leave a link down below to what I am using. And what choice you make is really going to depend on what kind of watercolors you want to make. If you are making watercolors and you are more of a landscape artist, you're going to want those natural earth pigments more than likely. If you are a card maker like me, you probably want those bright, bold colors, those mica powders. Eyeshadows are another great option. If you have a lot of extra eyeshadows laying around, you can crush those up and use them. They have the mica powders in them. But I went ahead and bought some from Amazon, so I had a number of choices. And there are so many different things you can do with mica powders. I'll have some videos coming on that shortly. But I'm using that set. I'm also using this set of fluorescent mica powders. These are a lot of fun, and they create some very, very vibrant colors that I love to use on my handmade cards. These are so bold and bright. The last one I will be using are chameleon. So these are color shifting. These are a lot of fun. You see these a lot on Etsy. All you need to make sure is that you get a chameleon color shifting pigment powder, mix it with your watercolor binder, and you've got the same color shifting paints. These are a lot of fun to play around with. And again, great on black cardstock, those kinds of things if you're a card maker. These are also really great if you're a hand letterer. These are absolutely gorgeous for those kinds of projects. Now, if you are wanting to make your own watercolors and you want to take a screenshot of the supplies right now so you can do some shopping, here's your opportunity. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is making the binder. You do not have to do this. You can buy a watercolor binder. However, I like to make my own. It's cheaper. I can customize it more, and it's not that hard to do. There are a few things you will be needing to make the binder itself. Here's the recipe that I used. Now again, this is just the recipe I use. If you find that this doesn't work for you, you can up your Arabic powder. You can down your glycerin. If you want more flow, add some glycerin, add some more glycerin. If you don't want the honey option, use straight glycerin. There are so many different things that you can do to customize this recipe, but this is the way I like to make it. So I'm going to show you how I do that. First and foremost, you need to make sure that you are using a 2-to-1 ratio of water to gum Arabic powder. Gum Arabic powder is what is going to be your glue, your binder that holds that watercolor to the paper. Those pigments, this is what it's going to bind to. To make this, to reconstitute it, you need to add 2 parts water. So here I'm putting in 3 tablespoons of gum Arabic powder. So in turn, I am going to put in 6 tablespoons, so I'm just going to double it, of my water. It's a pretty simple recipe. And from there, you can customize it yourself. Now, the gum Arabic powder, like I said, is what's going to bind it together. Then you need to add your water to reconstitute that. Use distilled boiling water. First of all, distilled water is going to have less of a chance to mold. You're not going to have anything added to it. It's going to take out everything, so it's not going to mess with your watercolor at all. You want it hot and boiling because that is what is going to melt down and kind of disintegrate that gum Arabic powder and allow it to become runny. When it's hot, it's going to do that faster. Can you use cold? Yes, but it might not fully dissolve the gum Arabic powder. This has a better chance of doing that. So use boiling water, use distilled water. You can make your own distilled water. That's not something I chose to do, but you can absolutely do it. I just bought the Parents' Choice from Walmart. It's in the baby section. It's fairly cheap. You just boil that up and add 2 parts of that to your 1 part gum Arabic powder, and then you stir it up. Now, as I'm stirring this, you are going to notice that there are some major clumps. That gum Arabic powder, it needs a minute. So this is not a 20-minute process and you are done. I would suggest when you are making watercolors, make your binder the day before. You want it to sit overnight to allow all of that powder to fully dissolve and all of your ingredients to kind of mix together. So the first thing I'm going to do is, of course, mix that water and that gum Arabic powder together. I'm going to give it a good little mix here, maybe crush out some of those powder blobs if I want to, but really the best thing that you can do is let this sit. You can, of course, help it along, get something flat. I'm using a measuring spoon here, and you can kind of crush those powder blobs down against the side of your jar, those kinds of things to help it along. You also want to make sure that when you're doing this, you're scraping along the bottom to get all of that powder out. If it sinks down in any of those corners, you want to make sure you get it out of those corners, scrape along the bottom, and make sure you have it all mixed in with the water. You're still going to have chunks. That's okay. It will eventually dissolve, but make sure you get it off the bottom so it has time. Then just set it aside, let it sit, and when you come back, you will be left with this glossy looking liquid. This is your mixture, your base that you need. From here on out, you can play with the additions and the amount of additions you want to do. Again, this is just what I like to do. Next, I am going to add 1/2 tablespoon of glycerin. This is going to add that plasticizer that it needs to harden. It's also going to allow it to reconstitute and also flow a little bit better. The honey is the same thing. A plasticizer, it's going to allow it to harden. It will also act as a little bit of a deterrent for mold and those kinds of things to grow in this. That's why I like to add the honey. I think it really helps in that. And it also gives it a little bit of flow as well. So I add 1/2 tablespoon of both of those. And then I'm going to add 2 to 3 drops of clove oil. Now this smells wonderful. It gives it a nice scent so you're not just smelling that gummy powder that it kind of has a stink to it. but it also acts as a natural preservative. You can stop there, absolutely, but to take it one step further, I like to add half a teaspoon of sodium benzoate. This is a food grade preservative. This is going to keep even more of that mold and things at bay. So if you live in a really humid climate, like me, and if you find that you have watercolors that do mold, this might be something that you look into. I have done this, and this has really cut down on my watercolor pans that end up molding on me. So just a thought, I like to add it. Again, it's what works for me. It's going to depend on what works for you, your climate, how you use your watercolors, those kinds of things. So that is my recipe. I like to mix it all up in my little jar, and then I am going to give it a stir with my stick, dissolve it as best I can. I'm going to lid it, put my lid on nice and tight, and I'm going to set this aside at least for a few hours. I do mine overnight. That's just what works for me. So I mix this up the day before and just let it sit until I'm ready for it the next day. But that is how you make the binder. Of course, you can buy it, and then you can totally skip this step. But now we are ready to start mixing the paint. So this is the fun part. This is kind of like the lab, if you will, where you get to start mixing and grinding and doing all those things with your pigments and your binder. So I am going to start off with one of my chameleon colors. These are so much fun. They do some color changing, but I'm starting off with this blue to purple shift. And I am just opening the jar first of all. That's what you need to do first. You need to get your pigment onto the mat. One thing to note about your mica powders and your pigment powders, these are very fine particles. A lot of them have glitter in them too. They can fly into the air and float around. If you are in an enclosed space and at this part of the process, it's not a bad idea to put on a mask just to protect your lungs, and keep them nice and clean and keep those glitter and mica particles out of your lungs. So put your mask on if you're using any sort of pigment powder just to protect yourself. You'll see as I start to dump this out how fine these particles are, especially those glittery ones, and also the fluorescent is very powdery, very pigmented, and if you sneeze on this, if you even breathe on it, it's going everywhere. So be careful. I'm going to start off with a small amount onto my craft mat. So depending on how much watercolor you want to make, it depends on how much pigment you want to put down. I am strictly making these for myself, so I don't need a ton of pigment down. I'm starting off with about a quarter sized amount. And then I just like to make a little hill out of it. And then in that hill, almost like you're making egg noodles or something along those lines, I make a little divot in the center with my palette knife, and that's going to be where I pour my binder to try to keep as much of it contained as I can. Now, depending on what pigment you are using, it's all going to depend on the amount of binder you use. If you are wanting to sell these, I would highly suggest that you keep a recipe binder for your different pigments. I am making them for myself, so I have a little bit more grace. If you are making these to sell, you want a consistent quality, so make yourself a little recipe booklet. And you can see here, I added a little bit too much binder. It had a little bit too much flow. So I'm going back and I am adding a little bit more pigment powder. So always keep a little extra back. And if you don't have any extra, then start off with a smaller amount of binder and add more as you need to. And I like to start off mixing with my palette knife just to get all of that powder wet and coated with the binder to start off with. Then once I have it kind of at a good consistency where I can see no more particle flakes, I will move on to mulling. As you're looking at this, you just want to make sure that your paint has a good amount of flow to it. You can see as I pull it up on my palette knife, it is a runny consistency. That is what you want. You don't want anything too thick. You don't want anything too thin. You want it just right, if you will. So kind of play around with your ratios. Start small, add more as you need to. And again, if you are selling these, please, 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 please make a recipe binder so you know exactly how much and measure. So start off with a tablespoon or a teaspoon and add a teaspoon and go from there and see how much you need. It's very easy to do, but that is going to give you a consistent quality. Now, once I don't see any more particle flakes floating around and it's doing pretty good, I will give you a little lift up here so you can kind of see what I'm looking at. It's so hard to see on camera, but I'm not seeing any more of those dry particles. So I'm going to start mulling with my muller. This is simply going around in a circular motion and smushing your paint, if you will. You don't want to grind it. You don't want to push too hard. Just even, not even pressure, just the pressure, normal pressure of your hand. And this should really glide. If you are using a glittery paint or a glittery powder, you might have a little bit of grit. For the most part with these, the particles are so fine, it's going to feel really smooth. And you just want to keep mulling that until you start to see a thicker consistency. So what is happening is all of those little, as you're mulling, all of those little pigments and particles are getting pushed apart and they're getting attached to that binder. And as that happens, you're adding more and more powder particles, and that's soaking up that binder and it's making it a thicker quality. You don't want it so thick, but you also do not want it super thin. It's going to thicken up as you do the mulling process. And as you're mulling, you might notice, oh, I've used up a lot of my binder. This is too thick. I can't move it as well. In those cases, you're going to need to add a little bit more binder and continue to mull because you don't have enough binder to your pigment powder to keep it attached to the paper. So keep mulling and make sure that you get a nice, consistent, even thickish layer. You will be able to feel it in your hands. Now, this can be a little bit of a tedious process. I would suggest putting on a movie, on a TV show, listening to a book, but something along those lines, just so you have something to do with your mind as you're doing this, or just totally space out. That's cool too. Here you get a little bit better look, a side view of what I'm looking at with the paint. You can see from where I started and where I am now how much of a thicker consistency I have. Again, not super thick, but thicker than what I started with. You're also seeing a little bit of that chameleon shift here. It is so cool. I absolutely love these pigment powders. They're a lot of fun to play around with, and making your own watercolor with them is even more fun. But there you can see just in there how much glitter and pigment I'm actually working with here. These are so pigmented and so glittery. You want to make sure you're spreading that out and breaking up all those little particles that are bunched together and getting them all attached to some binder so they will stick to the paper. As you are mulling, your paint is going to spread out to the edges of the mat. And what you're going to need to do is actually use that scraper or that palette knife, whatever you're using, and scrape that back into a circle and then start mulling again. That's going to help the process with your mulling, but also it continues to mix, but you also don't want to go off of your mat. I'm working within a very limited space. You can get a bigger mat and you won't have to scrape it up as many times. However, the smaller area, the more you're going to have to scrape it up. It just is what it is. You only have so much surface area you're working with. You're going to be pushing this paint out to the edges. You're going to need to scrape it up into the center and then start mulling and pressing it back out again. That's just the process that this is. But you can see as I continue to move this around how much thicker it's starting to look. You're starting to really see it kind of hold its shape in some of those hills and whatnot. And the process of mulling is going to be individual to each pigment you use. Some are going to take a lot less time while others take longer. Some can take 10 minutes, some can take 45 to an hour. Your longer ones are going to be more of your natural earth pigments, so keep that in mind. The mica powders and things like that tend to go a little bit quicker. The fluorescents are kind of in the middle. They take a little bit longer. They tend to stick together, those powders, and clump up. And that's where you really need to kind of smooth them out. It's going to depend on the pigment you're using and how it's reacting with that binder, how long you're going to have to mull. And you will know when this is done, first of all, by the thickness and the way you're looking at it, you'll kind of get a feel for it. But to check it, you need to test it. Now, to test it is very simple. You're going to use it just like you would a wet watercolor. Now, as you're testing these, remember, these are pure pigment right now. They have not dried down. So these are going to be very concentrated, very bright. When they dry down, they're not going to be quite as vibrant or quite as sparkly. So keep that in mind as you're using these. But it is a good kind of way to get a feel of what these are going to look like. So what I like to do is take a little bit off of my muller or my palette, whatever I'm working on with my palette knife, and put it onto a separate tray. I don't like to add any water to my mat at all. I put it onto a separate little piece of plastic or acrylic that I have here. And then I'm going to use a water brush. You can also use a regular brush and some water and do it that way. But I'm going to add a little bit of water to this palette and to the paint and give it a little mix up, because that's how these are going to be used. They are not going to be used straight like this. You will be adding water to them and diluting them down a little bit. So you want to add some water, give it a little mix up, and have a piece of watercolor paper handy. And then you're just going to apply that color right onto the paper. You can do a couple different strokes. I like to start off with less water, almost none. And then I will add that to the paper, and then I will add more water and continue that way. And then I just let these dry. I'll start off very vibrant, do a couple of test patches here, start off a little thinner on this next one, and then I might even go straight in with a little bit of paint and then put that on the paper itself. And that's going to give me a really good idea of how these are going to look and perform. So I'm looking here for consistency in the watercolor. I don't want to see any granules, especially if you're using those earth pigments. For the micas, you're not going to see so much, but for the fluorescents, you will. So no clumps of pigment, no granules. You want to see a nice smooth color. But for these glittery and those mica pigments, let them dry and let them set. And even the earth and the fluorescent pigments, let them dry, let them set up, just set them aside for a second. And once they're dry, you're going to rub them like crazy with your finger. But one thing I will mention is, as I am doing this, I am letting them air dry. I am also conscious of the type of paper I'm using them on. You can try them on different papers. I use just a mixed media or a watercolor paper when I put them on. Use them on whatever paper you're going to be using them on for their purpose for you. If you're a watercolorist, use it on your watercolor paper. If you're a mixed media artist, use it on your mixed media paper. If you're a card maker like me and you want to put it on cardstock and try that, I don't know that I would, but you can. Use what you're going to be using these on. Put them on that paper and set them aside to air dry. Don't blast them with heat, nothing like that. Let them air dry in the natural air. First of all, that's going to give you a good idea of how they set up without introducing any more heat or anything to activate that gum arabic powder. Because for the most part, a lot of people let their watercolor pieces and those kinds of things air dry. They're not reactivating that binder, if you will, with hot air. So don't use any heat or anything like that. Just set them aside, let them air dry. And as I'm letting that happen, I'm kind of scooping this back up into a little pile with my scraper so it doesn't dry out on me, because it can do that. But just scoop that up and I get that ready for the next process, which will be panning these or tubing these or whatever you want to do with them up. So I like to scoop them up. Now here's the thing with watercolor, especially making your own. These are precious. Don't waste any drop. So get it all scraped up, If you need to kind of reactivate some of those spots with a little bit more of your wet watercolor, do that. Scrape your scraper, scrape your muller, get all of that paint into a nice little pile. You don't want any of it wasted. And I will show you a little bit later on how you can make sure you use every last little drop that you make. So once I've done that, this is dry, it is ready to go, and I am going to rub it with my finger. That is going to give me a good idea of how these hold up. Are you going to go up to a watercolor piece and rub it with your finger? No. But if you're a card maker like me, they're going to go through the mail. They're going to get handled. You don't want this flaking off. So if you've done your job and the mulling process is done and you've used enough binder powder and you've done everything you need to do, what should happen is that binder should be attached to all those little particles. So it should be stuck down to your paper. If you have some that come off on your finger, then you need to go back in, you need to add more binder, and you need to work that in because you don't have enough binder to pigment to hold everything down to the powder. Either that or you haven't mulled long enough. So start off with mulling, see if you can get it there. If you can't, add more binder. But you want to rub over that and make sure it's not coming off the paper. So you're going to look for consistency. You're going to look for granulation. Make sure you don't have any of that left over. And you're going to make sure it sticks to the paper and you're good to go. Now, I showed you one powder. The great thing about making your own watercolors, you can mix and match here. So here I've got one mica powder that is gold and just kind of like a pearlescent gold. I have one that is a much more chunky, glittery gold, and I wanted to mix those two together. The chunky, glittery gold wasn't quite opaque enough for me, and that shimmery adds a little bit more opacity. So kind of mix and match your colors. Have some fun with it. Make your own custom mixes, and then you can really get creative, especially if you are selling these. You can make them your own, make something that nobody else has. When mixing two powders, there is no rhyme or reason. It is just whatever looks best for you, what look you're going for. I wanted a more chunky look here, so I added more of the chunky gold glittery look, a little bit less of the pearlescent. And then I just use my palette knife before I even add the binder, and I mix them together just to get a good idea of what this powder is going to look like. And I'll just eyeball it, get it all in a nice little area, and make my little well in the center and add some binder. That is the great thing about this process. No matter what you start out with, no matter what pigment you're using, it's the same process each and every time. You just need to make sure that you're using the right amount of binder to pigment and that you're getting a good mix and you're mulling it long enough to where everything is sticking to the paper. It's pretty simple. Now for this again, I like to add a little bit of binder, then I will mix it up with my palette knife and see where I'm at. If I need to add more, I can add more. If I need to add more pigment, I can do that. I'm really looking right now for a nice flowy consistency because again, as you mull, it's going to get thicker. You can always add more binder later on, but it gets a little tricky mixing it in. So I add a little bit more right now to make it a little extra flowy. And then I can start the mulling process. And as you do more of these and you find out what works for you and how these behave, you get more good at this process. It really is just trial and error and having fun with it. Not everyone is going to turn out perfect. Not every batch is going to be 100%. I've made some that are still tacky to this day. They just have not set up. And that's okay. They're still usable. They're still lovely. I still have fun playing with them, but not every batch is going to be 100%. That's why if you make a color that you love and you want to consistently use that color, write your recipes down as you do this. Keep a little notebook off to the side. Add your pigment in teaspoons or tablespoons if you're making a lot. I don't know. And then you added this much of your watercolor binder in tablespoons or teaspoons, or you can do grams, you can weigh it. There's so many different options. But keep that recipe, especially if you make a color that you absolutely adore. Now, this is one of those watercolors that has that really chunky, glittery base. So you can even kind of tell as I'm mulling this, it has a little bit of grit to it. It will lessen as I continue to mold this, but keep that in mind as you're using some of these. Not all of them are going to be a silky smooth texture, especially when you're using the chunky mica powders. They're going to have a little bit of grit to them, and that's never going to go away. So do your best, kind of feel out how much grit you have in the beginning, and keep an eye on it. You can even tell as I am smoothing this out how chunky and thick it already is. So again, if you get to a point where it's too chunky, you're really pulling it off of your palette, go ahead and add more binder. Continue to scrape, and if it's still got a little bit of that flow when you get it back into its little clump, its little circle, you're good to go. So as you can see, as I pull it up here, it still has that flow to it. I've got enough binder in there. It just is a thicker base. So it's going to have a little bit thicker texture, and that's okay. Even as I pan this one up later, you'll see in the photos, it is very chunky looking when it is dry. But I tested it. I made sure that after it dried, I couldn't pull any up off on my finger. It had enough binder in it. It was good to use. It's just got a different consistency and a different look. So not everyone is going to be the same. Keep that in mind as you're making these and you think you've messed up, just keep going. It's probably going to work out in the end. So here is a side look at mulling this one. I just wanted to give you a little bit more of a close-up on this one just so you could really see those granules of glitter in there and kind of see what I'm talking about. Just because every one of these is going to be a little bit different as you go about this process. So just keep that in mind and keep working them and keep experimenting with them and have fun with it. But even so, you'll get the feel of it. You'll be able to feel once this and see once this gets completely molded. Just continue through that process, and then we're going to do the exact same thing. The thing with these more glittery ones, you want to make sure you do a really good job of mulling this so it firmly stays attached to the paper. You're going to have more of a chance of those glitter particles falling off if you don't fully mull it. So we're going to do the same process. Again, this may take a few tries. You may need to test it a few times, but take a little bit from the palette after you've scraped it up, or you can do it before. Add a little bit of water and get that worked in with your brush, because again, you're going to be using these diluted with some water added in there. So you want to do that process and apply it to your paper of choice. You can see how vibrant and gold these are when they catch the light, and this is on white paper. You put this on gold or on black or other kinds of paper and it's going to really sparkle. But give that a chance to dry and give that a chance to set. Make sure you do it just in the air. Don't allow this any heat on it. And then give it a good rub with your finger once it's dry. If you don't have any particles falling off, you are good to go. This has been properly molded. It's going to stay attached to the paper as it dries. You're good. You're ready to move on to the next step. That is the same process for all of these things. But before I move on to the next step, I did want to show you one last powder being mixed together, and these are the fluorescent powders. So these behave a little bit more like your earth pigments. These are very fine, very powdery. We'll see them poof up here in just a moment. You want to make sure you definitely have a mask on as you use these. But these also, at the beginning, almost repel the binder. These have to be molded a little bit longer. They're going to require a little bit more binder. So I'll put, same process here, putting that down onto my palette, making a little well in the center, and I will be adding binder to these. And again, I like to use my palette knife when I first start mixing these up. But I'll just start off with a little bit of binder. These are ones where you definitely want to start off small and then add more and more as you need it. And then you can see as I start to mix this up, they don't want to immediately separate into that binder like our last two have been. You can really see those clumps of pigment in there, and that's where the mulling process is going to come in handy. The first thing you want to do though is just get all of that powder kind of wet, mixed into the binder so it's not going to fly off as you start mulling it. So start off with your palette knife and just mix as best you can to really get that powder incorporated. And be patient. This can take a few minutes. As you can see through this video, I'm not really speeding up the process a lot. I wanted you to see in real time so you're not fooled into thinking it only took her about 10 seconds to do this. No, it takes a little bit of time. You have to be patient. You really just have to work this in. And it can be a little frustrating at times, kind of chasing that powder around the mat, but take your time. It will all get incorporated. I also like to use a long palette knife while I'm doing this. That just gives me more surface area to kind of smush those powder pigments. But here's a nice close-up of what I am looking at on this palette. You can see those granules in that binder. You know this is not ready to go, obviously. You can see that separation, but you also have a little bit of powder up in that top hand now that I've turned this around. You just have to keep working that, pulling it down into there, into the binder and mixing and pressing and just giving it a good workaround to get it as incorporated as you can and wet so it's not moving around as you're mulling it before you even start the mulling process. So once I feel like I have a good amount of it mixed in, it's not going to be fully incorporated. You still see those granulation in there. You see those nice clumps. You're going to start the mulling process. And this is the exact same process you did before. The only difference is these are going to take a little bit longer. And this is going to be the same with like your earth pigments. If you use some spices, things like that, they're going to take longer to mull and press those powders into the binder and get some separation there. You can almost kind of see it here as I'm working it in. You can see that separation kind of pulling apart in those open areas. But as I continue to mull and just continue that process, it kind of all starts to bind together and come together and become more opaque and not separate as much. Once you get it out to the edges, of course, scrape it back in, but you do want to get this nice and flat, pushed all the way out to those edges, and just continue to work that around. And you might be thinking as you're doing this, the more pressure, the better. That is not the case. You really want to let the muller and the glass mat under it do the work and really press those pigments apart. So just give it some time. It will all come together. Scrape it up, continue to mull, and you will get to the step where it is all combined. Now, along the way, you are going to have to do some tests. These are going to be more of those tests where you're looking for granulation, clumpiness in the finished product, not so much falling off the paper. You still want it to be stuck to the paper and do your finger tests, but you're really looking for more granulation in those tests. You can see here, it was starting to dry out a little bit. I needed a little bit more binder. It was using all of it up that I had in there. So if you need to, you can always add a little bit more binder. This one I am grabbing a little bit of and throwing it onto the paper. I did not separate this one out. I really should have. I had made quite a bit of paint at this point and I was over the process, but really separate that out. That way you're not contaminating your final product. But you can see here, this is super, super fluorescent colors. I absolutely love it. And even when it is watered down, it's still so vibrant. I just adore this color. But you want that nice flat color, and then you also don't want any clumps. You don't want any of that granulation in there. And then you can pull some out with some water as well. And that's a really good test. As you wash it out more, you want to make sure you still have a nice solid color, and you're getting that kind of ombre look. You're not losing any of the color as you're pulling it down. And then of course, set this aside to dry in the air. Give it a nice firm press with your finger, kind of rub over it, make sure that it all stays put. Now, I did have just this last little thing I wanted to show you as I am mulling this. This is what you're looking for with those pigments that are kind of flat in color. They don't have that sparkle. You really want that nice kind of, not toothpastey, but just really lovely texture that you see here. And no color separation, no granules in there. You're seeing that nice flat wash of color. Even as I pull it out, some of those more spaces that don't have a lot of paint, you're still seeing a nice wash of color. That is what you are looking for as you're mulling this. So this is by far the longest of the process. After you make your binder, you mull your paint. Now it's time to fill and dry your pans. Now, I should say that this is one way to do this. There are a lot of different options of what you can do with your watercolor. You can put it into a reusable palette if you want. You can fill pans like I am doing now and allow them to dry out, reconstitute them with water later. I am not for sure, but you might want to double check a watercolor binder recipe to make sure that this is able to go into a tube. If not, it's going to be the same process. You might just need a different recipe for your binder. But the first thing you want to do after you have tested your paint, you know it is good to go, scrape it all right into a big pile. This is going to allow you to pick up as much as you can and put it into those pans. So I like to use a large scraper for this. These are fairly cheap on Amazon. I will leave a link down below for these as well. And all of these items that I've used today will be on my storefront as well. And now for this process, you are also going to need a palette knife. You can use the same one you've been using and just get as much of that paint as you possibly can, or you can switch to a clean one. It's up to you. But I like to start by scraping up as much as I can into a pile, and then of course scraping off the scraper because I don't want any of this paint to go to waste. Then I like to take my palette knife and I will start scooping up some of this product and letting it drip down into a pan or an empty pan. Now these are just plastic. You can buy them in white, you can buy them in clear, and you can buy them in different sizes. I like the 1/4-inch pans, but that is because I do not double fill mine. So you will notice as you put your watercolor into the pan and it starts to dry, it starts to sink. As it dries up, a lot of that liquid evaporates. That's what makes it hard. And then it just kind of condenses itself. So it shrinks down in that pan. And so if you are making these to sell, you need to plan on doing a double or triple fill of these. So the process for that is filling them up partial, especially if it's like a full pan, it's going to be quite large. So you want to fill them up partially, let them dry out for a couple of days, and then go back in and add as many layers as you need to until your pan is completely full. Now, because I am using these for personal use, I don't worry about doing that. I also know that I will be able, once these are finished, once I have used up all the watercolor that is in it, I will be able to reuse these. I can wash them out and continue to reuse and reuse and reuse as I want to. If you're making them to sell, obviously they're going to go to a different home, so you don't have that option. But for me, that's what I like to do. It does take more to do it this way. I realize that, more pans, but I don't have a whole ton of patience at this point. So I fill them up as much as I possibly can with my palette knife, and I just continue to do that until I'm out of paint. Now, if you want to double and triple fill these, what you need to do is put your paint in an airtight container and seal it well. That way it can stay wet. Then once the paint is dry, you can come back in and you can refill. Or you can fill once with the paint you have here, and as long as you have a recipe, you can make more paint and fill later as well. That's another option. But this is just the way I do it for personal use, and it allows me to have quite a few different pans to play around with. So then if I ever do want to make a travel palette, or I want to take a few with me, or even if I want to gift a few, I can do that. I'm not losing a ton of paint, and it's a good amount to start with. These paints really last a long time. I continue to fill, and with the amount that you see here, you're going to get a different amount of pans each time. With these smaller ones, the quarter pans, I can get about 4, 3 to 4. If it's a chunkier, I can get 5 to 6 pans. It really just depends. And the pans I buy come in a very large pack, so I've got quite a few to play around with. Now, once you get to a certain point, you're going to have just a tiny bit of paint left, especially when you're filling these up. And you can put that little bit of extra paint into another container if you want. That's fine. Or you can start a little dot card like I like to do, and I'll show you in just a moment. So for a dot card, you've probably seen these from quite a few different companies. You just want to start off with some watercolor or mixed media paper. You want a heavy paper that can stand up to some water, and that as it dries, that watercolor dries on there, it's not going to crinkle a whole lot. So a nice thick, heavy paper that can tolerate a little bit of moisture. So I'm using a watercolor paper here, and you can see my little dots. All I do is take the amount that's left because I don't want any to go to waste, and then I just scoop it up with my palette knife and make little dots onto this card. Now with these dots, you can cut them out and apply them to kind of a little to-go palette, if you will. You can make little samples with these if you are doing this for a business venture. Or you can make little samples to give to your friends if they enjoy this kind of thing. A lot of different things you can do with these, and a lot of fun to play around with. And it's just a great way to use up every last bit of that paint that you created. And I just love the look of these two. They're so much fun to play around with, and it's the perfect little amount of paint. That's also a great thing if you're running some classes. Now, one tip that I do want to share with you before I finish off, when you're filling these, there are going to be air bubbles. All you need to do is take a little pin, safety pin, clothespin, whatever you have, and just give those a little poke, and that will pop them. You can leave them. There are going to be some that end up in it no matter what, but try as best you can to pop those air bubbles as you're going. You can see here, it's just a little stick, and they just pop right away, and you get a nice smooth surface. The dry down time on each one of these pans is going to be a little different. You just want to check them after a few days. It does take quite a while, and it's going to depend on your climate how fast they dry as well. Also, the temperature, the humidity, a lot of different factors. But plan for a few days at the very least. Make sure you keep them on a nice flat surface. I like to keep them on a baking sheet and just keep them in a nice dry place. Now also, as these dry, like I said, they shrink. Here's a look at that shrinkage. You can see each one shrinks a little bit differently than the next, and they all dry differently than the next. So these two are chunky, where the first was super smooth, but it had more of a shrinkage effect. You can see all the different ways these dry down just in this photo alone. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and a look at how to make your own watercolors. I hope you get inspired to do the same. All the supplies I used today are going to be linked down in the description box below, as well as over on my Amazon storefront page. I have also tried to make this video very reference friendly, so if you want to go back and watch certain parts, they should all be broken up down below as well. That does it for me. Thank you guys so much for watching. Happy crafting.